There are many films depicting the horrors of slavery, but nothing as raw or bleak as this. Whether it's slavery or the Holocaust, portraying on film the barbaric atrocities that humans inflict upon each other has been popular in cinema for over a century. But with 12 Years a Slave, director Steve McQueen leaps bounds over the realism of those other films. The starkness and the realism of 12 Years even makes films like Steven Spielberg's exemplary Holocaust drama Schindler's List seem Hollywood in comparison. 12 Years a Slave is based on the book of the same name by Solomon Northup, a free black man from Saratoga, New York, who is kidnapped and sold into slavery. For 12 years, Northup endures hell as he transfers from plantation to plantation. With no hope of ever returning to his family, Solomon tries his hardest to hold on to the only thing he has left: his humanity. In 1809, Kentucky's Henry Clay recruited young men and Revolutionary War veterans to run for Congress. They elected Clay as Speaker of the House, and a new anti-imperial nationalism arose, reviving the American Revolutionary idea. They brought about a declaration of war against the British, and campaigned for the reinstatement of protective tariffs and government-sponsored infrastructure projects. The common people of the entire country joined in support of this policy shift. In retirement, former President Jefferson agreed with this second weaning from British principles, British attachments, British manners and manufactures. Jefferson said that our defensive war should bring about a spirit of nationalism and of consequent prosperity, which could never have resulted from a continued subordination to the interests and influence of England. South Carolina's John C. Calhoun joined with Henry Clay to lead the movement for economic nationalism, the American system. Though British invaders burned the White House and Capitol, the United States fought Britain to a draw. After the war, Americans were impelled to economic self-defense. When the British dumped manufacturers into the U.S. market at prices below the British cost, British leaders boasted that they were crushing America. Edinburgh Review founder Henry Brougham told the House of Commons on April 9, 1816, "A rage for exporting goods of every kind burst forth in 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars. The peace with America has produced somewhat of a similar effect, and it was well worth while to incur a loss upon the first exportation, in order by the glut to stifle in the cradle those rising manufacturers in the United States, which the war has forced into existence, contrary to the natural course of things. Now, North and South, united behind a nationalist agenda." The Founders Bank of the United States was rechartered after being shut down for 5 years. In this era of good feelings, the new president, Virginian James Monroe, made Calhoun Secretary of War to plan canals and to upgrade the U.S. Military Academy to be a civil engineering powerhouse. Under Clay's lead, Congress raised tariffs and authorized the military to design canals and railroads. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams formulated an anti-imperialist international strategy. The original American plan for ending slavery was now back in action. Iron forges and manufacturing plants would be built in the South and in the New West, nurtured by protective tariffs, national bank credit, and good transportation. As the British trade handcuffs were taken off the nation, feudal plantations would be abandoned in favor of much more profitable modern agro-industrial production. With the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery was to be restricted to below a certain latitude until it died out under industrialization. The British counterattack commenced in the run-up to the 1824 elections. Patriots backed John C. Calhoun, John Quincy Adams, or Henry Clay for president. But the same New York-Massachusetts treason faction that Hamilton had squashed in 1804 at the cost of his life was back at work. Aaron Burr's protege, Martin Van Buren, atop his own New York State political machine, like Burr's earlier one, traveled south in 1823. Van Buren assailed the Monroe administration and forged an axis of plantation owners with the pro-British northern elite. Van Buren's scheme was joined by the Bremen Tories, led by Timothy Pickering. Van Buren and the Brahmins backed Georgia free trader William H. Crawford for president. Pickering issued a pamphlet with old letters from John Adams insulting Thomas Jefferson. Van Buren gave Pickering's pamphlet to Jefferson, whom they hoped to prod into attacking the candidacy of Adams' son, John Quincy. But Jefferson wrote to the elder Adams, saying they were inseparable friends. John Quincy Adams did become president. He started up America's railroads, spurred canals all through the Midwest, and presided over the first blossoming of manufacturing industry. But over the next few years, the Brahmins' assaults on Adams, combined with Van Buren's schemes to drive Calhoun into the grip of the Southern plantation oligarchy, crippled the nationalist forces. Burr himself, having quietly returned from British exile, had invented the presidential candidacy of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Burr's Western secession co-conspirator and an old enemy of Jefferson, Burr's Jackson Project was tried unsuccessfully in the 1824 election. But in 1828, the Van Buren planter-financier apparatus, newly dubbed the Democratic Party, and employing screaming populist slogans, put Jackson in the White House. The result was a catastrophe for America. By 1840, cotton made up more than half of America's exports. President Jackson, tutored by Van Buren, took down the U.S. Bank, the protective tariff, and the transport building program. Van Buren himself followed as president, and after him there was a parade of radical free trade presidencies. Over the 3 decades up to 1860, with financial power detached from promoting industry, plantation slavery was becoming the leading feature of the U.S. economy, and slave owner politicians dominated Washington. More than 75% of slave cotton was exported. Cotton soon constituted over half of the value of U.S. exports. American slave cotton was now the centerpiece of the British Empire's world cheap labor system. With no prospect for industrialization, the southern states gave up their earlier assumption that slavery would gradually be eliminated. The Virginia legislature held its last debates on abolishing slavery in 1829 and 1831. As slave agriculture destroyed the soil of the southeastern states, the slave system would have to expand westward and push conquest southward into Latin America, or die out. As soon as Jackson was installed, and America was thus pinned down, the British commenced new irregular warfare. They sought to reverse the American Revolution by fracturing the Union along the north-south fault line, using British assets in both sections, working in tandem with and against each other. This would eventually lead to the War for the Union, more commonly known as the Civil War. One victim of the British-backed slave system was Solomon Northup, a professional violinist, farmer, and landowner in Washington County, New York. In 1841, he was offered a traveling musician's job and went to Washington, D.C., where slavery was legal. There, he was drugged and kidnapped into slavery. He was shipped to New Orleans on the 24th of April, 1841, by James H. Birch, aboard the brig Orleans from Richmond, Virginia. Northup was purchased by a planter and held as a slave for 12 years in the Red River region of Louisiana. He remained enslaved until he met Samuel Bass, who helped get word to New York, where state law provided aid to free New York citizens who would have been kidnapped and sold into slavery. His family and friends enlisted the aid of the governor of New York, Washington Hunt, and Northup regained his freedom on January 3, 1853. McQueen digs his knife in early, giving a taste of some of the luxuries of being free in the North before stripping them when Solomon is kidnapped. It's that reversal of fortune that sets this story apart from most others. While many stories about freed slaves begin with men or women having nothing and then rising to their freedom, 12 Years a Slave is the opposite, making the tragedy feel exponentially worse. The harshest atrocity in 12 Years a Slave isn't the whipping or the rape or even the hangings, but the absolute absence of hope. McQueen never lets this story become typical Hollywood fare by planting a false sense of hope. In reality, there was none, and Solomon knew it. Without hope, there were only two options: die or bide the time in that stifling, miserable hell. The conservative camera work by Sean Bobbitt adds stark realism. Most shots linger on the action. By doing this, Bobbitt and McQueen force the audience to see the full scope of the horror, whether you want to see it or not. For instance, quite possibly the most unsettling scene in the film has Solomon hanging from a tree. His feet just barely touching the ground, he is able to stave off suffocation by standing on his toes. McQueen sets his camera down, never moving and never cutting, as we, the audience, watch as Solomon suffers this near-death experience. Worse, so much worse, is that the other plantation slaves resume their business in the background, all too afraid to lend a helping hand. This may only last 90 seconds, but feels like an eternity, and is just one burning visual that McQueen's film will etch into your brain. I'm a huge movie fan, and have seen thousands of them. This one might be my favorite from 2013. The supporting cast features incredible performances, aptly by Paul Giamatti, Paul Dano, Benedict Cumberbatch, Sarah Paulson, Brad Pitt, Michael Fassbender, and more. Fassbender is especially noteworthy as the repugnant plantation owner Epps, a creature so unbelievably vile and drunk with evil. This is undeniably his best performance yet. Joining him as his wife is Sarah Paulson, whose jealous cruelty is senseless and despicable. Patsy is an emotionally broken woman who becomes the target of Epps' brutal and repulsive lust. While Solomon generally remains calm or reserved under the duress of circumstances, Patsy is audibly and physically representative of the culmination of atrocities inflicted on these men and women. It's a beautiful, incredibly sad performance of a young woman denied death in the face of a fate much worse. McQueen's 12 Years a Slave is rough viewing for sure, but tremendously impressive in its coarse depiction of humanity lost. From the performances, to McQueen's directing, to John Ridley's emotional script, 12 Years is a great movie. Just one of the most unpleasant ones you will ever see.